Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament book of Job. We begin at the 23rd chapter today. And before we look into the text, there's not really a lot to add to what we've been studying over these past few weeks. If you've been going along as we've been going through it, you'll know that this is we're getting towards the end of the back and forth between Job and his first three, what started as friends. I think I went over this last week. They came to him as friends, as mourners, and those who would bring comfort to him. And yet, by the time that we've reached this, it's long since past that. They're no longer offering him comfort. They're not offering him wisdom. They're not offering him anything. In fact, they've just become kind of antagonistic. And so it kind of is going in both directions here, but they're beginning to wrap some things up. And as we study through this part, you will notice that there are some things, again, that are insightful, I guess you could say. And you would say that if this was counsel that was given under the right understanding and the right context, it would be really solid. And again, their knowledge is not our knowledge. So, I think that there is that understanding that they make a lot of presumptions that we would never be able to make. And if you've been, again, following along, I've probably tried to illustrate some of those as we go through. But there are a number of assumptions being made by everyone in this that if we had a good understanding, or if they had a good understanding as we should, of what the Scripture has to say, what we have in front of us would never lead us to the conclusions that they did. So the idea that somehow God is distant, this is Job's whole thing. Somehow God is distant, and though he tries, and though he reaches out to him, God will not answer. And it leads him to saying things as whether it's he literally believes this, or if it's just as though it appears that God is not able to see things, and not terribly aware. But at the same time, he'll almost seemingly contradict himself that he sees everything because he's God. Who can say anything to him? So you can just see poor Job trying to figure the whole thing out. The other guys are pretty much that God only does this to bad people, so therefore this is what happens to bad people. And since it's happened to you, Job, let's do the math. Obviously, you're the problem here. So none of this is helpful. None of it is useful to Job. None of it is really missing or hitting the mark, I guess you could say. But the chapters shorten up a little bit in this section here, so we'll be able to move through a little bit of information here. But there are still, I guess the question could be asked: what's a book like this doing in the Bible? Because it doesn't have any of the law in it. It doesn't have any of those kind of things. It's obviously an Old Testament book. And it doesn't really kind of intertwine a particular part of history like you would have in the first 5 books and the prophets, the kings. All of that is about history. Now, this is a historical account, but we really don't know an awful lot about the people and the participants in this, other than what we find here in this book. So I guess the takeaway from this, once again, it really does refute a number of some of the major theological views that there are in the church. And so 2 of them that come prominently, and we went through these as we've kind of gone through it, I've made mention of it, but the idea that God is the one who determines all things, and that he's the one who man doesn't have any choice in the matter, it just happens, and God's the one who makes these things happen. This is a refutation of that from the very, very beginning of the book. Also, the idea that if a person is walking righteously before God, then God would bless them and continue to bless them because of their faith. And that if in the modern times, unlike what would been with Job, they developed this from a number of other places, even in some of the New Testament. But the idea that if we're his kids, we're entitled to certain riches and certain things, and they twist the Scripture to as Peter would say, to their destruction. These are people who do these silly things that they make no sense, but they read into the text. And we do run across some of this as we study through the book of Job. What it really helps you to understand is that maybe some of the things that are being sold in churches nowadays is not necessarily so new, just kind of rewrapped a different way. So we'll get to some of those examples as we go through these chapters between here and 31. kind of the closeout of these three and Job and their back and forth. So we start at chapter 23. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll tackle the text here. Father, we thank you as you gather us here, and as we take this time to avail ourselves to the study of your word. We would ask, Lord, that you would give us understanding ears and hearts and minds, and that we would be able to make proper application of what we read. And why would these things be important? What is the necessity that we know them? And so what we may glean from this, God, would you just give us, again, wisdom and help us in our understanding by your Holy Spirit? And we ask all of this in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 23, Job answers, and he says this, "Even today my complaint is bitter. My hand is listless because of my groaning. And oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat." So Job saying, if only I could plead my case. Now, he's done this before, but this is, again, think about where he is in this. Everything that I've done so far to try to reach him has just turned back on me. There's no way that I'm able to have any dialogue. I can't plead my case. It's almost as though he's been judged for something that he feels wrongly judged, and he would like to just be able to appeal to someone that whatever is causing all of this problem, if only I could tell my side of it, there's been a misunderstanding in this. And he's going to say this a few different ways. So he says, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments," or with the explanation as to why what has happened to me is wrong. And so it's the arguments that he would say would be basically his defense. Everything that I could say that would be able to counter what is happening to me. So again, it puts you in his mind that whatever has befallen him is something that God has done. And they all have concluded that God judges the wicked. Here in this case, though, the one difference with Job and the other guys is that, but there's no wickedness in me, though this is what happens to the wicked. But he also says there are times when you'll see the wicked and they will live their whole lives in all of the things that this world can offer them, and they don't go through the things that I have. So clearly he sees a disconnect here, and you see it repeatedly in his dialogues, in his monologues, I should say. So he says, "I would fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me." That means if I could only plead my case, I know what he would say, because he would find that I'm not guilty, though he must think that I am at this point, which again gives the impression, if only he had all of the information. So step away from this in the application side of it for us. Is there anything that you could possibly tell God? And he said that before. Is there anything that could be said to him that he doesn't already know? And yet here it is. There's something that is obviously not made it to him, because if I could plead my case, it would go a different way. There is, the upright could reason. Verse 6. "Would he contend with me in his great power? No, but he would take note of me." So would he continue all of what's been happening thus far? But if he knew all of it, no, he would actually give me respite from this. If only he knew, he would give me respite. "There the upright could reason with him, and I would be judged forever be delivered from my judge, forever from my judge. Look, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward I cannot perceive him. When he works on the left hand, I cannot behold him. When he turns to the right hand, I cannot see him. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall know, or I shall rather come forth as gold." So he says, again, this idea, if it doesn't happen right now, I can't find him, but the day's going to come when I can. So there's that expectation. And once it has really been adjudicated, which he thinks I'm being punished, but nobody's really heard the case. And he's also said that it's really only God who's responsible for this. But so he's able to see some, but he can't see the whole picture. So he says in verse 11, in verse 11, he says, "My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than necessary food." Two things to point out here. One is that he says, I have been obedient. but he's talking about things that were from his mouth and that were written. And so, of course, it begs the question, what are these things? Clearly, they aren't the law. The timing doesn't fit. But not only that, even from the law itself, in the books that were there, if it was a time during the law, the things that are written out there would help him to understand God is none of the things that he assumes him to be. He's not a God who would judge things without knowing the entirety of the matter. He would also know that God is there and would hear him and answer him, though it may take time. So the thing that has really caused the entire problem is a heavenly issue. And until it resolves, which is really in his life, until it's resolved, God is not going to answer him. It's not that he can't, but this is going to have to, if you will, play out. So you can kind of see in his own mind. I'm fascinated. What did they have in writing? What was it that gave them their understanding? Because he says, look at how he says this. It sounds like the kind of stuff that David would say. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than necessary food. I'm sorry, that was a sound from my phone. I'm supposed to be silencing that every time. I apologize. So he says, in verse 13, he says, but he is unique, and who can make him change? And whatever his soul desires, that he does, for he performs what is appointed for me. And many such things are with him. Now, this sounds like what a modern day Reformed person or a Calvinist would say. It's everything's predetermined. He's the one who causes all of these things to take place. But let's make sure, if you believe in those things, this is not a proof text. This is in a whole series of his presumptions. He's made a number of presumptions that are completely inaccurate, some of which he's already done even in this chapter. So this is not teaching of doctrine. This is not teaching of theology. This is the musings of a guy who can't figure anything out and just says this among a number of things that are inaccurate about God's nature and how he does the things that he does. For, verse 14, he performs what is appointed for me, and many such things are with him. Therefore, I am terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am afraid of him, and I would be too. So, that idea, as we get from the Reformed camp, is that since God is the one who predetermines everything, even who is and who is not saved, we, even the devout, would be able to say, well, right here and right now I'm doing well, but one of their planks, if you will, is the perseverance of the saints. And the perseverance of the saints is something that you will know once a person dies in faith. But I've seen so many people that have believed and turned away, and they would say, well, they were never saved to begin with. Well, then nobody else can say that they're saved either. You won't know until you have persevered until the end. So the perseverance of the saints. This is the kind of thing that, again, he makes these presumptions, and he says, if that's the case, that God is the one who determines all these things, I'm terrified of him. And again, I would be too, because you don't know what he's doing. So what we have in the person of Jesus in our modern times, we can say, no, God has made very, very clear that this is what we do to walk rightly and honorably before him. We're not just programmed to do things. We have a will and we have the capacity to obey or disobey. And it's not that he predetermines every decision that we'll make. He knows every decision that we'll make. So here, I think you can see how Job makes the same assumptions, unbiblically so, and it causes a terror in him. And again, if this is how God did things, and I really don't know what's happening tomorrow, I can't see the end of the line because I don't really have that assurance. Who knows if I'm going to do the same things that everybody else did, and I'm not really saved to begin with. So just really, how torturing would that be? Verse 16, for God has made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of darkness, and he did not hide deep darkness from my face. So, again, it's all come upon me. And so how can I not be terrified if I believe that he is the oppressor ultimately? And for reasons unknown to myself, I've been appointed to this calamity that's befallen me. And when I've cried out, there's no one to hear. If I want to plead my case, there's no one to hear it. And so again, that idea of determinism and that it's God who says this and that, You don't have any choice in the matter. I've selected you for eternity. I've selected you for an eternity of torment and sorrow. And again, that's kind of as God as Job sees him. God's going to reveal himself to be considerably different at the end of this book. And then chapter 24 says this. Now, since times are not hidden, this is Job continuing, since times are not hidden from the Almighty, why do those who know him see not his days, or know of him? Why don't they take notice of him and his interactions with things? Now, you're going to notice that he's turning his attention towards the people who do wicked things. And so, what should be the end with them? Because it's clearly he's going to be making the case that kind of the other guys would have been making. And yet, why do they not? His point is, why do men, when they know of him, why do they not take notice? So in verse 2 it says, some remove landmarks, they seize flocks violently, and they feed on them. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless, and they take the widow's ox as a pledge because she has debt. They take that as payment for it. You take a person's ox and they don't have a way to plow the field. You just see the downward spiral of this. Now, his point is, this is what the wicked do. Look at what we read in the last part of the chapter where he just says, this isn't where he is. Look at what he says there at verse 10 of last chapter. He knows the way that I take, and when he tests me, I will come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not despised the commandment of his lips, and I have treasured the words of his mouth more than necessary food. That tells us everything. I don't care how far back we want to go in this, until this point and going forward, that is Job's assessment of himself. Doesn't care what the guys are saying that are listening to him, and thereby he's able to say, and yet we see people doing these things all the time. Now remember, some of these things are the accusations that have been made against him. That idea that he took his time of when he had great wealth and power, that he exploited people, and because of that, God's paying him back. He's already said, here's where I stand at the end of chapter 23. Chapter 24, he starts to lay out what their accusations are, that it is like him. That's what's happening to you, Job. Job is saying, no, I'm right before God, but there are those people. Why do they not pay attention? Why do they not care? Indeed, like wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work, searching for food. And these are the people that have been cast aside. They've been run over by the powerful. And these are the ones that, I'm sorry, I looked at verse 3, but I did not read verse 4. These people who drive away the donkeys and take widows' oxen, they push the needy off of the road, and all the poor of the land are forced to hide. So they're afraid to be around them. They're pushed out of the way as they proceed by, and the poor are so afraid of them that they scatter. And what do? Indeed, like wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work searching for food. The wilderness yields food for them and for their children. They gather their fodder in the field, and they glean in the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing, and they have no covering from the cold or in the cold. They are wet with the showers of the mountains, and they huddle around the rock for shelter. Some snatch the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge from the poor. They cause the poor to go naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves of the hungry. They press out oil within their walls. They tread wine presses, yet suffer thirst. So this is the point, that even by doing all of this exploitation, it's never enough. And that's where he's talking about, such are the wicked. And so he says, when you see in verse 11, they press out oil within their walls, and they tread wine presses, yet they suffer thirst. The dying groan in the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not charge them with wrong. And this is to him a perplexity. How is this that man would do this, knowing that God is right and just, and yet they would do these kind of things? And it's kind of a self-answering question, because it doesn't seem to cost them anything. They're able to get away with it. And so there are some places that we've seen in the last few chapters where he says the same thing. How is it that the wicked can do the things that they do, and that there isn't the same kind of judgment that there should be? And it would be a pretty interesting question to ask, and then for him to say, well, we see plenty of wicked people that don't have to pay for anything, so Job could say of himself, why am I being judged? Other people do all kinds of wickedness. I've pronounced my innocence in this. His friends don't want to hear what he's got to say. Clearly, they're not moved by this. But again, it's him just kind of working through it. I guess you could say working through the problem. So he says, there are those who rebel against the light. They do not know the ways of it, nor abide in its paths. The murderer rises with the light, and then he kills the poor and the needy, and in the night he is like a thief. The eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he disguises his face. In the dark they break into houses which they marked for themselves in the daytime, and they do not know the light. So again, we could say in a New Testament sense, this is kind of the same thing. And although he speaks a little bit about their boldness, that they get up in the morning and they do violence, and yet at night they try to do things under the cover of darkness. So we do find that there is that kind of imagery that's also used in the New Testament as well. And the heart of man is, well, Jeremiah tells us, the heart of man is deceitful and it is wicked above measure, to the point where who can possibly know it? And it's asked almost rhetorically, and then God says, I know the heart and I try the reins. So in this case, once again, this would be so perplexing to Job. How is it that people can do this? Not only why do they not end up being repaid for their wickedness, but how is it that they know full well that God is just, they know about him, and yet they just run headlong into the things that they do that are so worthy of judgment? And again, I have to ask the same question, especially when I encounter those people who have at one point, they've attended church, they have said everything that I have ever said as far as what I believe, and yet at some point they just turn their backs. And they would deny that they've turned their backs, but they have. Their lifestyle is a completely different thing. They pay no respect to him. Now, they may not be the kind of wicked people that are here, but again, the idea that they can somehow be right before God, but with every breath, they make a mockery of any kind of faith like that by their actions. It's an interesting thing. Again, we don't know what goes on in the hearts and the minds of people. 4, it says, the morning is the same to them as the shadow of death, and if someone recognizes them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. They should be swift on the face of the waters, or that they should do what they do very quickly, like a spray of water on the sea. Their portion should be cursed in the earth, so that no one would turn into the way of their vineyards. So they should be separated. God should not, well, in his way, his reckoning, if there's justice, they shouldn't be able to do the things that they do. As drought and heat consume the snow waters, so the grave consumes those who have sinned. The womb should forget them. The worm should feed sweetly on them. He should be remembered no more. And the wickedness should be broken like a tree. For he preys on the barren who do not bear, and he does no good to the widow. Now, remember, at the beginning of this was Job saying in the middle of all of his calamity, at the very, very beginning, if only God had just killed me and taken me out of this, I wouldn't have had to do this. Now here, he basically says, and that's what ends up happening to the wicked. Nobody remembers them. They're people who are just consumed, and may it be that the womb never even remembers them. It's kind of what Job was asking would happen to him, that the date of my birth would be forgotten, and everybody would just be able to go on it as though it never had happened. Interesting that he's now saying this against those people. But here's what he says in verse 22. God draws the mighty away with his power. He rises up, but no man is sure of life. He gives them security, and they rely on it, yet his eyes are on their ways. So they have what they feel is security, and yet God sees. And it says, they are exalted for a little while, and then they are gone. They are brought low. They are taken out of the way like all the others. They dry out like the heads of grain. Now, if it is not so, who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? So again, prove me wrong. And we could look at this and just say, yeah, and I mean, to some extent, but we also know quite a bit better that when a person dies, that's not the end of things. And he's already said, interestingly enough, back in chapter 19, he knows that he will have a bodily resurrection. But he doesn't speak about that when it comes to the wicked and when they die. And so his focus is just on the temporal of things. And when they die, they're forgotten. There's nothing that's there. There's nothing that's left. They're forgotten. But he also has some understanding about life after death. And so, again, we will know when we leave this earth and these things are known to us, we'll know what Job knew and what was the source of his knowledge. Because sometimes he says stuff, it's like, man, that is so insightful. And other times it's like, that is so inaccurate. But it's kind of hard to hold him accountable because he doesn't know what we know. So again, when I read these kind of things and I take the time to think about it, as we all should, I'm so thankful for the time in which I live, because God has by this time given us the word to read, Old Testament, New Testament. We have Jesus to look back on in his life. We know what he has done and what he has accomplished. We know how complete and thorough it is, and that nothing is really left that needs to be done. And so we await our gathering to him. So we have the writings of the New Testament that gives us more detail about what we believe and why we believe it, how we're to conduct ourselves here in this life. That's all stuff that we have in writing, and it is available to every person who comes to a knowledge of the Lord. Even to people who don't, it's still there. The Bible's able to be seen by anybody in the world. I should say there are some places where you just can't get to it, the places where crazy people are and run things. But even in those places, from time to time, people are still able to get their hands on it. Interesting, though, and yet here we have so much privilege, I guess you can say, in most of the world, that being able to access the writings that are here in the Bible that could answer so many questions are readily available to the people who desire to see it. So, chapter 25. Now, this is very, very short. This is the last thing that Bildad will have to say. And notice that what he ends up saying is insightful. It's absolutely correct. And yet, he doesn't even try to make an argument against Job. Rather, he just reaffirms everything that has been said that is accurate about God and how he does things. And really with this, when you read it, you'll go, how do I find fault with that? So, Bildad answered, and he said, dominion and fear belong to him. He makes peace in high places. And is there any number of his armies? Upon who does his light not rise? Great question. He's almighty. Who is it that could possibly stand against him? And then, so again, the idea of dominion and fear, or reverence, awe that's there. Dominion is the authority, the power, the sovereignty, just who he is. This is theology 101 kind of stuff here. We believe this, and it's easy to prove through the text that we have. Now, again, who told Bildad this? He doesn't have the writings that we have, that we know. So how does he know what he knows? And again, all we can do is ask the question. We don't have an answer. Verse 4, how then can man be righteous before God? Or how can he be pure who is born of a woman? And we know the answer to that as well, that all sin falls short of the glory of God. That if we look in the Old Testament, that man's righteousness is as filthy rags. It's soiled garment. And so we can take a look at that and just go, yeah, so I can't disagree with this either. And yet to the New Testament believer, this is such a cool thing. Even when we say something like that, we're also having to balance that and make sure that we understand that even though those things be true, the fact of the matter is that the same God who is so far above us and beyond our ability to fully grasp and understand, loved us enough to pay the price and the penalty for our sin that we could be reconciled to him. Again, mind-blowing, but it's not something that I have to struggle to try to grasp. It's right there in the text. I'm told by reading the scriptures. So it says this, now, if even the moon did not shine and the stars are not pure in his sight, then how much less man who is a maggot, that's a pretty bold way of saying it, and the Son of Man who is a worm. So if God is so far above that, who is man that he's even brought into the conversation? Now, fast forward a bit until we get to David and we get to the Psalm 8 passage where it just says, When I consider the heaven, which is the works of your hands, who is man that you're mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you would visit him. And he says, but you've made him a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned him with glory. So David looks at this, and just all I have to do is take a look into the sky, and I understand, and we know so much more than David knows about the vastness of the universe. And God spoke it into existence. If he can do something that is so magnificent that even people who understand astronomy, and they can look at the pictures from these telescopes that go out into the far reaches of the universe, just hard to imagine how vast and enormous it is. There aren't even words to describe it. And then, like David, I have to say the same thing, especially now, understanding what we do. Who is man that you're mindful of him? And I think it's a good thing for all of us to be reminded at the same time to say that. Thinking through it. When I look at the whole of your creation, and I can stand in awe of what it all encompasses. Who is man that you even take notice of him? And we know from the rest of what we have in the text, we know from the New Testament, we know that God would say, if that was something he could answer, is, but I created mankind for fellowship. And even though he fell, though he rebelled, though man is just made that way, Jesus, my son, came to pay the price for their sin. And those who would trust him, when this corrupt and this broken earth and this life is over and they're gathered to him, all of that stuff is gone and things are put back as they were originally. At the beginning, when God created Adam and Eve, when everything was pure before sin had entered in, we get back to that place and we get to walk and have fellowship with God as they did. This is his intent. This is his desire. So who is man that you're mindful of him? Man is valuable enough in God's eyes that he would pay any price to redeem them to those that would come to him. Again, let your mind just wrap that stuff up of ways and kind of take it all in and consider it. It's an amazing thing. So he says these 6 verses, solid. I can't find anything wrong. And he doesn't say, but Job. There's nothing else. He just kind of stops right there. So Job replies, and here's what he has to say to Bildad. But Job answered and he said, how have you helped him who is without power? Now remember, whether he's saying this directly to Bildad, the other guys are there too. They're all hearing this. There's nothing that tells us that they come to him separately. But remember when Job first spoke, they're all sitting there. 7 days later, they're all sitting there, and then he speaks, and then this dialogue ensues. But he says this, now, how have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you consoled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many, to whom you have uttered words, and whose spirit came from you? So his point is, these are mostly the accusations that they made against him. He lacks understanding, he's broken, he's this, he's that. And so he says, okay, if I take your assessment of me, with all the things that you've said, how's it been of any benefit to me? You're my counselors, my friends. So we heard at the beginning, you're the ones who mourned when you saw me. You threw ashes on your head and you tore your garments. You did all the things that are just typical of mourning for another person that you see who's in just a horrible, horrible place. So here we are all these chapters later worth of things that they've said, and they've heaped those things upon him, and he's asking the question, what benefit have you guys been to me? How has anything that you've said, though you say that you're the ones with wisdom and I lack it, all the things that they've said kind of consolidated in this few verses, how has it been helpful? What have you done? The dead tremble, those under the waters and those inhabiting them. Sheol is naked before them, and destruction has no covering. He stretches out the north over the empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the water in thick clouds, and yet the clouds are not broken. He covers the face of his throne, and he spreads his cloud over it. So, again, this is that way of just saying he's so grand. He's able to do such things that are amazing and beyond our ability to understand, but it's as though he conceals and hides himself, which is, again, not accurate. It's not true. And he's going to find this out soon enough, but this shows the impatience of when people go through trials. Now, again, it's easy to say that because I've never gone through anything like this, but something that we ought to be able to learn? We know this, that God is not, he's not in a place where he is not paying attention. He knows everything that goes on. When we cry out, he hears. When we ask, he answers, maybe not in our time, but we need to remember that he will ultimately answer. He is not aloof. He's not distant from us. There are things, if our answers don't come, there are things that we just genuinely don't understand. Very much like Job. We should learn that part from this. But so as he says the things that he says, again, could there be frustration? Absolutely. Should there be frustration? In an earthly sense, absolutely. How can you not just cry out and ask for something and try to have some kind of an understanding? Once again, we have the benefit of knowing from the book of Job and other things that are like it, that we don't get to the place of accusing God of doing things in some punitive sense. The scriptures just don't teach that. So when we say things, they may be said in anger, but we want to make sure that we don't cast God in a type of light that doesn't fit him. So again, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, he sees everything, he doesn't learn anything. It's all right before him. All of human existence, all of eternity, start to finish as we can think of it, it's all before him. He's outside of time. So he's able to see all these things. So it says he covers the face in verse 9 of his throne, and he spreads his cloud over it. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters and the boundary of light and darkness. That idea that he separated light from dark, it's just speaking of the types of the creation, the things that he had done. The pillars of the heavens tremble, and they are astonished at his rebuke. He stirs up the sea with its power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. What an interesting thing that is. Now, he stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks the storm. They understand that Job here is able to understand something that we saw Jesus actually do. That once again, the idea of the storm coming up, this is a good, interesting question. On the Sea of Galilee, more than once, storms would come up. One in particular, if you remember, they thought that they were going to die, and they came and saw Jesus in the back of the boat on a pillow sleeping, and they came back and said, "Don't you care that we're dying here?" As though somehow if the boat went down and they died, that it wouldn't affect him. Just the idea, that the hysteria of people who know the waters very, very well. So they're in a full-fledged panic, and Jesus is able to have that mastery over the physical creation. He created it, he might as well. But he said, "Peace be still," spoke to the storm, and I'm of that school of thought that when he said, "Peace be still," I believe it went instantaneously from raging to you can't see a ripple on the water. Clouds would have parted, whatever it would have been. I believe that he rebuked everything about it, and it changed from turbulence and just craziness to absolute total calm. I would expect that of him because God doesn't do things in small ways. And with everything that they had already seen him do, remember what the disciples said against each other? Who is he that even the creation has to obey him? So they saw something that they had not seen before, that was something that made them marvel, though he had done so many things that would have qualified for their awe in times past. So it says in verse 13, now by his Spirit he adorned the heavens, and his hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Some question about that, and is it speaking of celestial things, and the idea of piercing is more speaking, again, part of the creation part of it. Is it speaking about, some people speculate that they're talking about one of the celestial bodies, in this case, the serpent. There's a constellation. And there are some other constellations that are mentioned in this book. So is it something like that? But there, again, this whole part of it is he's speaking about God's creation and the vastness and the greatness of it. And yet it's as though God, who does all these great things, conceals himself. That's more Job's, why are things like this? So he says, indeed, these are mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? So, once again, that idea of him being omnipotent and all powerful. But again, he just doesn't understand, how is it that I can't have my interaction, how I can't plead my case. So we get to verse 27, which is the continuing of what Job is saying. Moreover, Job continued his discourse, and he said, as God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will speak not wickedness, or not speak wickedness. Nor will my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say, you are correct. So speaking to his advisors. Let's look at this again. In verse 2, as God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul, made my soul bitter. Even though, remember what in the chapter 1 and chapter 2 was the accusation that Satan made. The only reason he blesses you, remember it was God who said, have you considered my servant Job? In both cases, chapter 1 and chapter 2, the first one was take away everything that he owns and he'll curse you to your face. He didn't. Chapter 2, make him a mess physically. Make him sick. Make him just want to just die because he's so overwhelmed by the boils and everything else. And he'll curse you to your face, and he doesn't do so. So once again, he says the same things here. Now, God, as God lives, who has taken away my justice, the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, he sees God as the oppressor in this case. But notice what he does here. Those two things are not seen as accusations against him, because he says he won't do it. As long as my breath is in me, and my breath, the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not be reproached me as long as I live. So, once again, this is that him looking at his counselors and saying, I don't care what you guys think anymore. There's nothing that you've done that's of benefit to me. He said that in the last chapter. So whatever you guys want to rationalize and think that you've got figured out here, could not care less. I'm going to continue to plead as I've pleaded before God. I will not lose my integrity, and he's not going to make his accusation and curse God in this, because that was the opening, again, salvo, chapters 1 and 2. And had he done that, he would have made Satan out to be the correct in what he kind of put out as I'm lacking a better word than wager. I would wager, Satan would say, that if you take away these things, then he'll curse you. In this case, that would be a lack of integrity. Even though God he sees as his oppressor, yet I won't retaliate in kind. I won't say anything outside of my integrity. I will retain my righteousness, my right standing before him. Now, in verse 7 he says, may my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me like the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much if he takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? And will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? Now, again, if hypocrisy was Job's problem, Job's able to say, well, if that was the case, would I continue to plead as I've been pleading? Would I continue to reach out to him? Would I continue to not bring the accusation against him? They're referring to him as being hypocritical. You say one thing and you do another, so God's judging you. So let's read those again, because look at what he says, and he could make this about himself and basically ask a number of questions. So may my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me be like the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much? So he doesn't have anything left. There's no hypocrisy that there could be for him. So he asks also, though he may gain much, if God takes away his life, what's there for him? Verse 9, will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty, this hypocrite? Will he always call upon God? And this is what Job is doing. Remember, even in the midst of all of this, he says the day is going to come when I will get my hearing before him. And I'll come out, as he said in the last chapter, I'll come through it as gold. So he knows if I could just plead my case, God would hear. I know what he would answer. So this is, again, another asserting of his own, I'm right before God in this. I'm just not able to communicate with him, and I'm not able to get him to see it. He thinks God doesn't see it because there's no shelter to him. There's nothing that's coming to take away the problems, though that is coming. Now, he says in verse 11, I will teach you about the hand of God. What is the Almighty that I will, what is with the Almighty I will not conceal? Surely all of you have seen it, and why then do you behave with such complete nonsense? So again, you should be able to come to the same conclusion as I. You want me to take your counsel, you want me to believe the things that you're saying, but you haven't believed anything that I have. So the point is, you've just spoken past me the whole time. So I'll say these things to you. I'll teach you about the hand of God, and what is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Surely all of you have seen it. So why then do you behave with such complete nonsense? So even themselves, if they just take a look at the world around them, Job's helped them to do that. Look, the wicked get away with a lot of stuff, and it seems like they never have to deal with any of the consequence of their time here and the things that they've done. Yet we know that when they go down to death, there's nothing for them. Now, he doesn't understand. He never elaborates that there is some kind of eternal punishment that's coming to them. And whether he has a reckoning or an understanding of that is not told to us. Or at least he doesn't say it. This is the portion of the wicked man with God, and with the heritage of the oppressors that have received from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall be satisfied with shall not be satisfied with bread. So brought to destitution. They're just a horrible condition, and the only thing that they're born for is that they will be conquered. Those who survive him shall be buried in death, and their widows shall not weep. Can you imagine that? When the sons of the wicked, these people who are, like he's been talking about for chapters, when their time is done and they're killed, their widows will not even weep for them. They're just such horrible people. Again, this is all, it's the hypothetical person, but it's a type of person, the wicked. So, though he heaps up silver like dust and piles up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the just will wear it. So somebody else is going to take possession of it, the just in this case. And the innocent will divide the silver. So this is his way of understanding that God is just. Those people who do the things that they do, their day will come, and everything that they have amassed to themselves will be taken from them, and it will be given to others. Now, interesting, this works in a bit of a different way. Remember when the children of Israel were coming in, and God tells them, it's in Deuteronomy 6 and into 7, where he gives a bunch of warnings and reminds them that you're going to come into a land where there's already inhabitants. It's not an uninhabited land. So when you get there, you're going to find that it has all kinds of riches. It has all kinds of cities and cisterns that are built, and fields and vineyards that are already planted. You're going to come in and you're going to take over those things. They're already put there for you, and God gives it to them as their inheritance because he's judging the people that put them there. And he says, you're going to take these things, but remember where it came from, lest you forget. And you'll go back to the way that things were. You won't be thankful for what God has given you. And remember later on, when the temple is dedicated through Solomon, he talks about that same thing, that the day is going to come, if you rebel and don't seek me again, that the things that you've labored for, that foreigners are going to come in and they're going to take over the things that you have had to abandon because you've been taken away. And that happened exactly like that, not only to the northern kingdoms in time, but to even Judah itself when it was taken by Nebuchadnezzar. So in the void of them being gone, people went in and took what belonged to someone else. So here, basically the same kind of thing. It's just God has reserved those people as he does that, and they will pile it up, but the just will wear it in verse 17, even the clothing. The innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth and like a booth which a watchman makes. The rich man will lie down, but he will not be gathered up. He opens his eyes, and he is no more. So again, just very temporary. Whatever he does, thinking it's going to last forever, it doesn't. So Verse 20, terrors overtake him like a flood. The tempest steals him away in the night, and the east wind carries him away, and he is gone. If you ever get a chance to, it's kind of very sad, but some people, I can't, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but people had compiled some of the kind of things that some of the most prominent people, some of the most affluent, wealthy people that we've known for hundreds of years, some of the things that they said at the end of their lives, and you just realize they were terrified because there was no hope for them, and everything that they had ever amassed in this lifetime, they obviously weren't going to take it with them. Doesn't mean that they bowed the knee, which they should have, but you could see that they're searching those things out. Now that they're at the end of their life, there's nothing. They are just destitute. So riches and all those things doesn't buy you anything if you're at the end of your life and you don't have an understanding of the afterlife and what happens next. So it says the east wind, verse 21, carries him away, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls against him and does not spare. He flees desperately from its power. Men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. That idea of kind of mocking them as they go. So again, they're starting to wrap these things up, Job in particular, and his whole reckoning of what happens in this temporal life to the righteous, to the wicked, what becomes of them, what becomes of their things. If there is some kind of justice, even in the earthly sense, this is what they've been able to see. It just goes on like this through history. This is just kind of the history of man. So it doesn't say anything that we haven't heard before. It's just, again, it's kind of musing, it's poetic, it's kind of just a person putting to words what they believe is the case when it comes to how life treats the wicked and how it treats the right and the righteous. And even though there's trouble, again, it's that reasoning about how does this work. So in this life, this we know. The rain, as the Bible says, the rain falls on the just as it falls on the unjust. And so, again, so many different places in this that there's just nothing that you can say, well, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and there's no in between, or there's no crossover in those things. We know that to be not true. So at the end of it, we basically say we live in a fallen world. It's a fallen creation. And it's a fallen creation that God has come to redeem. And so our time here on this earth is short compared to the history of man. But what we are wanting to make sure that we pay close attention to is eternity. So as we read through these things and make the application, we want to say that all of these arguments and the things that they say almost primarily are dealing with the here and now, trying to make sense of what happens in this world. And we will get the objection from people all the time about this is that, well, why would a God of love allow this, that, and the other thing? And the questions are more than you can count. And really, we always come back, and we should come back to the same answer. You're concerning yourself with this temporal world. I'll answer the question as best as I possibly can from Scripture about why things happen here on earth the way that they do. Beginning with it's a fallen creation, and bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. It's just part of the way that things are. But God's concern is more of the eternal. God looks to give us peace and comfort in this life in the spiritual sense, and sometimes that may not always translate over into the physical world, but it's only for a time. We want to make sure that we understand that. Job is a great case study in that. Everything was great one day, it's wrecked the next. And it will take some time until everything is revealed and God is able to reveal what all took place, and then everything is restored. There's not always the promise of restoration, and we want to make sure that we're careful with that too. It's not just some kind of a way of saying this will always happen like it happened with Job. We don't have that assurance. We want to be very careful, though, to say we don't make assumptions about God and assign guilt to him for doing things that we have no way of knowing. So if we don't know what is at the heart of a particular matter, it is better to just say, we'll pray and we'll wait until God gives us an answer rather than make assumptions. We see this book is filled with them making assumptions, and it's turned out horribly for these guys. And nothing has been accomplished from it. So we're going to pick up at chapter 28 next week, and we'll get through probably the last part of this, hopefully get to chapter 31, and that's kind of the break of the things that are said by the three and by Job, and then it moves on to another part. There's somebody else that has something he wants to end up saying. So we'll pick up that one next week when we're together at chapter 28.